if you are not a shoplifter and you've been picked up on suspicion of shoplifting, but in the pursuit of that question, you're found to be not supposed to be in the country, why not send those people home?
Well, why not is because we have to listen to our law enforcement professionals. The big city police chiefs across the country have said, wait a minute, we're being asked to enforce federal law, and what it's doing is it's undermining our efforts to build relationships with immigrant communities in a way that makes it harder for us as police to do our job of fighting crime. Let me give you an example. In Rudy Giuliani's New York, they were trying to solve a murder, and Rudy Giuliani had a very progressive policy on this. He said, we don't want our cops being immigration agents, we want them being crime fighters. They couldn't solve a murder because the key witness was an undocumented Irish guy, a guy here illegally from Ireland who wouldn't come forward thinking he would have contact with the system and get swept up in the deportation. Only when they reassured him that he would not have any contact with immigration did he come forward and they solved that crime. And you have these tough captains of police in New York saying, we do not want to be seen as immigration agents in immigrant communities. In New York, 50% of the population is immigrant. So it undermines crime fighting and, quite frankly, what these programs, look, if these programs go after the worst of the worst, I'm all for it. Go after the criminals. But when you have a woman driving down the street with a broken taillight, who's here, who's a housekeeper, who's been here 15 years, and she gets pulled over, brought into the station, charged so they can check the system, swept into deportation, you separate a family, and you undermine confidence in the community. In Mecklenburg County, where Charlotte, North Carolina is, for example, they had a 287G program, very aggressive. Within the first 18 months, they picked up more than 5,000 people and funneled them into the deportation machine, and only a tiny percentage had anything to do with crime. The police were being very aggressive about stopping brown people for any violation they could come up with, bring them in, charge them, and turn them over. This was a deportation vacuum cleaner, not a let's go after the worst of the worst program.
Well, one of the frequently heard ripostes, answers in this argument is, what's so hard to understand about illegal, or what part of illegal don't you understand? So, Ali Noorani, what part of illegal don't you understand?
What part of a solution do we really need? I mean, the solution that we really need is to make sure that people who are here illegally are required to get right with the law, required to pay their taxes, required to go through a criminal background check so the worst of the worst aren't allowed to stay, and then required to get on a path to legal status. That is a solution that actually fixes the problem. To say, what part of illegal don't you understand, avoids reality, ignores reality. Because the only solution to that is, as my colleagues have said, is to spend billions of dollars in tax money on an enforcement-only regime, which will lead to mass deportation, which will undermine the trust of communities, and which at the end of the day, the concern of law enforcement right now is that with the Republicans in charge of the House, the Republicans who will be in charge of the appropriations process will say to local police who want to have trusting relationships, who want to enforce local law, that they will say, you know what, in order to get federal money, we will require you to enforce federal law. So local police who want to keep their communities safe want to keep doing the job that they're doing to focus on local law enforcement, not be forced by Republicans in the House to act as immigration agents.
In a lot of places, these charges, these stops, have to do with driving. But now it's more and more difficult, as every year passes, for people who are in the country illegally to get a driver's license. So by definition, you're breaking the law if you're driving from place to place. But it is the law. It is the law passed by the legislatures of these states and carried out by the local municipalities that issue driver's licenses. And yes, there's utility and what's practical and what's a good idea, but also there's the law. The law is the law, and if we catch you making an illegal left turn or an improper lane change, and you don't have a driver's license, well, obviously you can't get insurance either. A lot of it pursues from illegal status, but it's against the law.
Right. It's against the law because the law hasn't changed in over 40 years to modernize it so that we deal with reality. We have 11 million people here illegally. They came here because we employed them. They came here because we wanted them to help grow our economy. In Charlotte, that example I just mentioned, the whole construction industry was based on Mexicans coming up and filling these jobs. Everybody knew they were coming illegally, but there was no way for them to come legally. There's no line for them to get into. So now you have a situation where you have a population the size of the state of Ohio, and opponents say, well, we're going to make them disappear. That's not realistic. Should we give them legal status and then the next 11 million? No. We have to deal with the problem in a comprehensive way so that we end illegal immigration and deal practically and humanely with the fact that we have 11 million here. If we don't do both of those things, we are going to have a difficult time explaining to the American people. But that's why we're talking about a comprehensive approach that does a number of things. Stop people at the border if you can. Crack down on illegal hiring because there's a help wanted sign 100 yards in from the border, and a legal workforce because otherwise you just drive them further underground if you have a full-out employment verification system. Those are the three elements that are going to have a legal workforce, legal entry, and will reduce illegal immigration to a problem. In the
Before we go to our next break, I have to ask Elizabeth. Local law enforcement has told me on many occasions that in order to enter the 287G program, they had to lay on extra training for their officers, make them aware of what federal law is and what it requires, and that their officers are not violating civil rights laws, not using racial profiling, that they're making good collars, as they say in police lingo, because they're laying on this extra training. And I went through part of the training when I was in Arizona during the introduction of SB 1070. Are we finding violations?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't want to conflate SB 1070 with 287G or secure communities because they're each very different, and the information that we have about each is very different. The most harmful part of SB 1070 was enjoined by the court, so we don't see it in effect except in so much as officers are taking it into their own hands to go ahead and begin doing what SB 1070 would have had them do. With 287G, there are numerous reports showing that regardless of what training is being received by these officers, the program is fundamentally flawed. In fact, the Office of Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security came out with two very damning reports last year showing that the program is flawed in so many ways as one would wonder if those could ever be reconciled. And with secure communities, we've struggled very hard to come up with information. There are reports from various places showing that despite whatever training these officers have received, there would tend to be trends showing that there is racial profiling, that people are not being treated fairly through these programs. But part of the problem that we have is not getting the information from the Department of Homeland Security and from Immigration and Customs Enforcement.